They came to Briar Hollow to be saved. They left in shrouds. The convent stood at the farthest edge of the valley, where the river bent like a crooked finger, pointing toward the hills. In the summer, wildflowers swayed in the wind, spilling their colors down the slopes. In winter, the land turned pale and brittle, the wind carrying whispers that no one could quite make out. Travelers said the place had a stillness unlike anywhere else, as if the air itself were listening. It was that stillness that many came for. In 1894, Briar Hollow was little more than a scattering of farms, a general store, and the convent of St. Edda's Mercy. The sisters there spoke of healing, of quieting the restless heart, of easing the pains the body could no longer bear. They promised no cost, no penance, no sermons to choke down with bitter bread. Only rest, only peace. They never spoke of how peace was bought. The first to arrive that winter was a widow named Eleanor Finch. She had lost her son to the river, her husband to the bottle, and herself to grief so deep she sometimes forgot the sound of her own name. Neighbors found her sitting by the banks in the snow, fingers blue, murmuring lullabies to the current. The sisters welcomed her with warm broth and a bed near the chapel, where the floorboards smelled faintly of rosemary and ash. By the week's end, she was smiling again. By the month's end, she was gone, her body carried down the winding road in a plain pine box. The sisters said she passed in her sleep, her face serene, the strain gone from her eyes. They wrapped her in white linen and lowered her into the frozen ground, whispering that she had finally found rest. No one questioned it. Who would? More came, a farmhand with a cough that rattled his ribs, a seamstress whose hands trembled too much to thread a needle, a boy who woke screaming every night, saying his dead sister stood at his window. Each was welcomed the same way, with gentle voices, herbal tea, a room warmed by the chapel's great hearth. Each seemed better, brighter, calmer, and each left in the same shroud of white. By midwinter, 78 had come, 78 had been buried. The sisters said the Lord's will was mysterious, that some were simply called home sooner than others. They smiled as they said it, not the brittle smiles of grief, but the soft, certain kind that made doubt seem shameful. But there were things the townsfolk noticed, even if they didn't speak them aloud. The soil in the convent garden stayed warm, even in the coldest weeks. Visitors swore the air inside the chapel was thick and sweet, like fruit gone to ripe. And sometimes, on nights when the snow lay unbroken and the moon was low, faint chanting could be heard through the hills, low, slow, almost like the river's own murmur. No one knew the words. The healer among the sisters was said to be Sister Magdalene, a woman with hair white as frost and eyes so dark they looked bottomless. She rarely spoke, but when she laid her hands on the sick, they said warmth spread through the bones, melting pain like ice in spring. People claimed she had been at St. Edda's since before the war, yet she never seemed to age. Children stared at her as if at a ghost. It was Sister Magdalene who welcomed Jonathan Caro that December. Jonathan was not sick, not in the way others were. He was a writer, or had been, before his hands began to tremble and his nights filled with shadows that moved when the lamps were out. His last manuscript lay unfinished in a drawer, its pages spotted with candle wax and ink blots. He told himself he had come to the convent to rest, to recover his mind. But in truth, he had come for the story. The deaths in Briar Hollow had reached the city papers. Quiet rumors traveled faster than the snowstorm that followed him north. 78 in 3 months, all under the care of St. Edda's, and yet not a single accusation, not a whisper of wrongdoing. Jonathan smelled a lie. The convent rose before him in the dusk, its stone walls pale against the dark hills. The bell tower was silent, the air heavy with wood smoke and something else, a scent he could not name, sweet and metallic. Sister Magdalene met him at the gate, her hands folded in the sleeves of her habit. "You are weary," she said, though he had spoken no word of it. Inside, the convent was warm, lit by candles whose flames did not seem to waver. The corridors smelled of thyme and old wood. He was given a room overlooking the garden, its soil black against the snow. That night, Jonathan woke to the sound of footsteps in the hall, slow, deliberate, not the quick tread of a nurse, nor the dragging limp of a patient. He sat up, listening, until they faded toward the chapel. In the morning, he asked about it. Sister Magdalene only smiled. The sisters pray at all hours. The work of mercy does not rest. Jonathan nodded, though his unease deepened. The others in the dining hall moved with a strange calm, their eyes dull but peaceful. A man with a hacking cough no longer coughed. A woman whose hands had trembled now held her spoon steady. Yet their faces were pale, their voices slow, as if speaking from somewhere far away. That evening, he wandered the halls until he found the chapel. Its wooden pews were worn smooth by decades of hands. The altar held no crucifix, only a great bowl of polished stone filled with water, so still it reflected the candles perfectly. He leaned closer, and for an instant, he thought he saw not his own face, but another, gaunt, hollow-eyed, and smiling faintly. He stepped back. Sister Magdalene appeared behind him without a sound. The water remembers all who have been healed. Here, she said. Jonathan wanted to ask what it meant, but something in her gaze told him it would be unwise. That night, the chanting began again, louder this time, though still too muffled to make out the words. Jonathan rose, wrapped himself in his coat, and followed the sound. It led him through the west corridor, down a narrow staircase, and into a part of the convent that smelled faintly of damp earth. He stopped before a heavy wooden door. Light flickered beneath it. The chanting was clearer now, a low, rhythmic murmur that made the hair at the back of his neck rise. He leaned closer. The door creaked open an inch, and a rush of heat met his face. Through the gap, he saw the sisters gathered in a circle around the stone bowl from the chapel. Only here, in the glow of dozens of candles, the water was black as ink. Something moved within it, slow and sinuous, like a shadow come to life. One by one, the sisters dipped their hands into the water, lifting it to their lips. The blackness clung to their skin before sinking in, vanishing as if swallowed by the flesh. The air seemed to pulse with the sound of their voices. Jonathan stepped back too quickly, his heel striking the stone floor. The sound cracked through the chanting. The sisters froze. Sister Magdalene's head turned toward the door. Her eyes met his through the narrow gap. "You cannot take what you do not give," she said softly. Jonathan fled. He did not sleep the rest of the night. And yet, come morning, he found himself in the garden, staring at the black soil, wondering what might be buried beneath it. The air was warm there, even as snow fell around him. Behind him, the chapel bell began to toll. By the week's end, another patient was gone. White shroud, pine box, quiet smiles. Jonathan began to wonder if the sisters could take away sickness, grief, and despair. What else might they take? And if salvation was never free, who decided the price? Tell me, if you were offered perfect peace, knowing it would cost you everything you are, would you take it? In the year 1890, they whispered of it the way one speaks of a ghost one half believes in. A place deep in the marshlands of Virginia, where sickness unraveled like smoke, where the dying rose from their beds, and where hearts splintered by grief found themselves whole again. They called it St. Hildegard's Mercy. The convent was older than the war, its stones blackened by decades of damp wind. From the road, it seemed to rise out of the water itself, its reflection shimmering in the sluggish pools of the marsh. Willows hung low over the path, their thin fingers trailing the surface, as if testing the water for signs of life. Travelers came in wagons, on foot, in creaking carriages pulled by horses too thin for the weight they bore. They came carrying coughs that rattled the lungs, wounds that refused to close, minds clouded by grief and despair. The abbess, Sister Miriam, greeted them all. She was a tall woman, her frame weary but strong, her skin weathered like parchment. Her eyes were the color of storm water, pale and gray, with a depth that made you feel as though she had already weighed and measured you before you spoke. Her smile was open, warm even, but it was the sort of warmth you might feel standing before a fire whose smoke could choke you. If you stayed too long. When Elias Carr arrived, the air was cold and wet enough to sting his lungs. His sister Clara lay slumped in the back of the wagon, her skin fever hot beneath a damp cloth. For 3 weeks, he had watched the illness burn through her, first in her eyes, then her breath, until her voice was too thin to rise above a whisper. The doctor had told him to prepare for the end, but Elias was not a man who yielded easily. The marsh road narrowed until the wagon wheels sank deep in the mud. By the time he reached the convent gates, his coat was soaked through, and his hands were cramped from gripping the reins. Sister Miriam herself came to the door. She looked at Clara only once, laying a long-fingered hand against the girl's forehead. Elias thought he saw her close her eyes, not in prayer but in some wordless measure. "She will walk again," the abbess said simply. Inside, the air was warmer than Elias expected, the scent of lavender clinging to the thick stone walls. The convent halls were quiet, not the absence of sound, but the kind of quiet that felt deliberate, like a place where sound itself was unwelcome. Candles burned in long rows, their flames steady despite the drafts that whispered along the corridors. Clara was carried to a narrow bed in a room that overlooked the marsh. The sisters tended to her with a gentle precision, pressing dark herbs to her lips, murmuring prayers that did not sound like any scripture Elias knew. Their voices were low, rhythmic, like breath drawn from a single, unseen body. By morning, Clara's fever had broken. By the third day, she was sitting upright, her hair brushed and her voice steady. On the fifth day, she walked barefoot along the chapel's aisle, pale but smiling. Others in the convent spoke of similar blessings. A coal miner who had coughed up blood for months now sang softly to himself in the garden. A woman whose right eye had clouded white could see again, her gaze sharp enough to thread a needle. A young soldier, pale and drawn from an old shrapnel wound, now walked the marsh path with no limp at all. It was enough to silence doubt. But Elias noticed things. He saw that the sisters rarely slept. They moved through the halls with a strange, tireless grace, their eyes shadowed by something more than fatigue. At meals, they ate little, and sometimes not at all, though their hands did not tremble and their bodies did not thin. Each night, after the lamps were extinguished, faint chanting seeped through the chapel walls. It was not the warm hum of hymns, but something deeper, low, deliberate, and strangely inhuman, as if the voices belonged not to many throats, but to one. The sound unsettled him, though Clara claimed not to hear it. As her health returned, he saw another change. Her skin, once flushed with fever, had taken on a waxen pallor. The warmth seemed to have gone out of her, though she swore she felt strong. Her voice, though clear, trembled as if each word belonged to someone else and had been loaned to her only for a moment. He could not say why this frightened him more than the fever had. Winter came early to the marsh. Ice clung to the willows, and the water froze in jagged patches that reflected the pale sky. More travelers arrived. A mother carrying a boy whose lungs wheezed with every breath, an old man with hands twisted by arthritis, a seamstress with eyes gone dark from infection. St. Hildegard's did not turn them away. Elias saw the pattern before anyone spoke it aloud. For every miracle that filled the air with whispers of gratitude, there was a quiet burial in the graveyard beyond the willow trees. The coffins were simple, the ceremonies brief, the mourners few. The graves seemed to multiply overnight, fresh, mounds of earth standing in rows that reached farther toward the marsh with each passing week. Once, on a frost-heavy morning, Elias followed the toll of the chapel bell to the graveyard. He stood at the edge of the willow line, watching the sisters lower a pine box into the ground. The wind carried no sound of grief, only the soft murmur of voices speaking words he could not catch. Sister Miriam turned and saw him there. Her expression did not change, but her gaze lingered long enough to send him back along the path without a word. He did not tell Clara where he had been. That night, the chanting was louder. Elias rose from his bed and followed the sound through the corridor, his bare feet cold against the flagstones. It led him past the chapel door, down a narrow stairwell that smelled of damp stone. At the bottom, he found a heavy door, its iron handle cool beneath his palm. Through the crack, candlelight flickered, throwing thin shadows across the walls. He could see movement, the black outlines of the sisters, their heads bowed, their hands raised over something he could not see. The chanting deepened. It seemed to pull at him, each note like a slow breath drawn through the bones. He stepped back before the door could open. By morning, Clara's cheeks were a little paler, her smile a little more fixed. She said she had slept well, but her eyes did not look rested. Elias thought of the graveyard and the way the willow branches swayed even when there was no wind. He began to wonder if the sisters could take sickness. Could they also take what made you truly yours? And if they could, what would they do with it? Tell me, if someone promised to heal the one you love, but left you knowing they would never be entirely themselves again, would you say yes? The snow fell without sound. By midwinter, the marsh was glassy with ice, and the convent's windows glowed like watchful eyes in the dark. Inside, the air was warm as ever, heavy with the scent of herbs and wax. Elias spent his mornings in the garden, watching the sisters tend to the rows of withered stalks with the same care they gave the living. In the afternoons, he wandered the halls, taking note of who had arrived and who had gone. It was a quiet census, kept in the back of his mind, until curiosity led him to the small chamber beyond the chapel, a place he had not seen before. The door stood ajar. Inside, the smell of ink and dust lingered in the cold air. Shelves lined the walls, each holding rows of narrow books bound in black leather. The light from a high, narrow window fell across a desk, and there, left open, was a ledger. He told himself he was only glancing, but his fingers turned the pages. Names, so many names, written in the same precise hand. Dates beside them, each entry ended with a short note in Latin, a language Elias only half understood. But the numbers told their own story. 70 burials in 3 years. That it was more than the worst years of the town's plague. More than floods, fevers, and hard winters combined. These were not townsfolk. The surnames came from places far beyond the marsh, cities, villages, counties Elias had only passed through by train. And besides certain names, there was no illness recorded at all. He traced the ink with one finger, feeling the slight indent of the pen strokes. It was then he heard the soft footfall behind him. Sister Miriam stood in the doorway. "These," she said, her voice calm, "are the ones who refused to receive the gift fully." Elias closed the ledger. What gift? Her eyes held his for a long moment, as though measuring whether he deserved the answer. Life, unburdened. Some cling too tightly to what harms them. Fear has its own poison. Fear doesn't put people in the ground, he said. Her mouth curved in a shadow of a smile. Does it not? She stepped aside, allowing him to pass. He walked out without another word, but the pages stayed with him. The names, the quietness of their endings. That night, Clara was gone from her bed. Elias found her in the chapel. She stood barefoot on the flagstones, the hem of her nightdress brushing the floor. The great stone bowl at the altar was filled to the brim with water that seemed darker than before, almost black in the candlelight. She leaned over it, her breath stirring the surface. When she turned toward him, her face was flushed, her eyes bright. "I feel lighter," she said, "like something heavy was taken from me." Her voice was soft, reverent. He wanted to ask what exactly had been taken, but before he could, 2 sisters entered from the side door, their eyes passing over him without surprise. One guided Clara gently toward the pews, the other moved to refill the candles. The next day, he heard the same words from others. A miner, his lungs now clear, like a shadow's gone from me. A seamstress, her fingers nimble again. Something heavy's been lifted. An old woman who now walked without her cane. It feels like I gave something back, and now I'm lighter for it. They spoke without fear, without hesitation, as though to be relieved of some invisible burden was the most natural thing in the world. Elias felt the opposite. With each story, his unease deepened. He began to walk the graveyard more often. The willow trees were always in motion there, even when the air was still. Their long branches hung low, pointing toward the chapel like mourning veils drawing the eye toward the source of grief. It was there, among the rows of markers, that he noticed it. Certain graves, though marked with dates reaching back decades, had earth that had not settled. The soil was loose, dark, as though it had been turned recently. When he knelt to touch it, he felt a faint heat, too faint to be natural in the dead of winter. The headstones bore strange verses. Return the gift, and you shall be made whole. Become part of the breath that is unending. To keep is to decay. To give is to rise. The phrases left a bitter taste in his mouth. They did not speak of heaven, or God, or the comfort of rest. They spoke of cycles, of exchanges, of something being taken and something else being given in its place. That night, he dreamed of the chapel bowl, the black water rippling without touch, the sound of breath drawn in unison. He woke with the image of Clara's pale hands resting on the surface, her reflection looking back at him with a smile that was not hers. The days blurred. Snow fell, melted, and fell again. Patience came, and the air swelled with their gratitude. Few ever left. The ones who did stayed near the marsh, taking rooms in the village or finding work on the edge of the valley. They walked as though listening to something distant, their faces calm in a way Elias had begun to mistrust. He noticed the sisters most of all. They did not change. Their skin neither paled nor flushed. Their eyes were never red from lack of sleep, though Elias had never once seen them lie down to rest. Sister Miriam's hair was silver, but not the brittle silver of age, rather the cold gleam of frost that does not melt. When he tried to ask a patient how long the sisters had served here, the man only smiled faintly. As long as theirs. Then breath to give. It was not an answer. On the 7th night of snow, he stood in the garden, staring at the chapel door. The willows shifted above, their branches swaying toward it with a strange insistence, as if pointing, as if guiding. The chanting began again, low, steady, the same rhythm he had heard that first night. Clara passed him in the corridor without seeing him, her bare feet soundless on the stones. She moved like one walking in a dream, her gaze fixed on the chapel ahead. He did not follow, not yet. Instead, he returned to the ledger room, striking a match for the lantern. He found the earlier volumes, ledgers bound in the same black leather, the ink as crisp as if it had been written yesterday. The names reached back beyond his own birth, beyond even his father's youth, and yet here and there, in the columns, marked sister, the names did not change. Miriam, Agnes, Ruth, Magdalene, the same names. Decade after decade, the air in the room grew colder. He closed the book, his pulse quickening. Healing here was not the removal of sickness, it was the exchange of something vital. A trade that left the body whole, but not untouched. And trades, Elias knew, always had two sides. As he returned to his chamber, the thought grew heavier, pressing into the edges of his mind like frost creeping across glass. If the sisters never aged, then whatever they were taking, they were keeping. And if they were keeping it, what, exactly, was left in the bodies they buried? Elias stood at the chapel door until the cold from the stone floor began to creep into his bones. The sound he'd heard before, the low, unbroken chanting, now felt heavier, more deliberate, as though the very walls carried the rhythm. Through the narrow crack, the world beyond seemed dipped in candle-dash gold. The sisters moved in a slow circle round the altar, their black habits rippling like water, lips shaping words too old to belong to any prayer he knew. In the center, the bowl of black water shimmered with a light that was not entirely from the flames. The healed stood in the inner ring, their heads bowed, hands clasped. Clara was among them, her nightdress ghostly pale against the shadows. The chant deepened. The patients exhaled all at once, long and trembling, their bodies swaying. Elias waited for the inhale, but it never came. They stood motionless, mouths slightly open, chests still. The sisters inhaled for them, a slow, deep drawing in, as if taking something from the very air between them. Elias's stomach turned, as the patients seemed to steady again, standing taller, calmer, though their eyes were half-lidded, unfocused. When Clara turned to leave, her steps were too precise, her gaze glassy. By morning, the chapel was silent, the candles cold, the altar bare, the bowl was gone. Clara claimed she had slept through the night, though when Elias mentioned the chapel, she frowned as though at a word in a foreign tongue. Later, as she dressed, he saw it, over her heart, just above the collarbone, a thin white spiral, no, wider than a coin, the skin faintly raised as if from a burn or a long-healed cut. The marsh road was gone that afternoon, where packed earth had been. Black water stretched to the horizon, swallowing the path back to town. In the distance, the willow branches swayed though no wind touched them. Sister Miriam found him standing there. The waters will recede, she said, in God's time. Her voice was kind. Her eyes were not. Winter's grip deepened, wrapping the marsh in a shroud of frost and silence. The convent stone walls held warmth, but outside, The world was locked in ice, the dark waters swallowing paths and hopes alike. Then came the new rivals. Among them was a boy named Thomas, no more than 8 or 9, his small chest ragged, with coughs that shook his thin frame. His mother, pale and worn, left him at the convent gates with a whispered prayer and a hope too desperate to name. Elias watched as the sisters took Thomas inside with their usual calm, their hands gentle and sure. He did not expect miracles, not anymore. Yet within 3 nights, the boy's cough stilled. His cheeks flushed with color, his breaths came easier. But the light in his eyes, the spark that marks a child's wonder, faded, replaced by something still and hollow. Elias felt a chill every time Thomas met his gaze, as though the boy's soul had retreated, leaving behind only a fragile shell. That night, Elias's dreams turned dark. He dreamt of suffocation, of drowning in cold air. He saw a woman's pale hands close over his mouth, fingers tight and merciless. Her breath was icy against his skin, and her lips pressed to his face in a kiss that stole the very breath from his lungs. He woke choking, gasping for air that was not there. The following dawn brought news no one could have prepared for. Thomas was dead. His body lay in the infirmary, pale as winter's snow and light as a feather. His chest rose and fell not at all. The sisters spoke, quietly, their words a balm and a blade all at once. His gift was incomplete, Sister Miriam said, her voice soft but resolute. Elias's heart thundered in his chest. He refused to believe that the gift was healing, or peace, or mercy. It was something darker, something stolen and spent. He resolved to keep watch, night after night. He hid in the shadows of the convent, his eyes fixed on the chapel. He watched as the sisters gathered, as the patients entered the inner circle, as the black water shimmered in the altar bowl. He saw the slow, rhythmic breathing, the exhale and the stolen inhale, and the vacant eyes of those who had been given back their health. The price of the gift was paid in silence and breath, in light and shadow, in bodies and souls neither fully alive nor entirely gone. Elias knew then that the healings were a bargain forged in whispers and blood, a bargain he was determined to break, no matter the cost. The convent had grown quieter, not the comforting quiet of a place at peace, but a heavy silence that pressed against the walls like a fog dot in the chapel. The longest-standing patients sat for hours, their bodies still and rigid yet swaying just enough to betray some deeper unrest. They breathed shallowly, each inhale a faint sigh, each exhale a whisper lost to the thick air. Their eyes were glazed, unblinking, fixed on nothing yet everything, as if waiting for something beyond the reach of time and space. Elias watched them from the shadows, heart pounding with dread. There was no life in those faces, only the faintest echo of it. He had never seen such stillness without death. One evening, hidden behind a tapestry in the corridor, he overheard Sister Miriam speaking softly to a younger nun. "They are vessels now," the abbess said, her voice low and certain. "Only the body remains until the final release." Elias shivered. The words echoed in his mind long after the sisters disappeared down the hall. Vessels, containers, hollow shells holding something unseen, something waiting. Meanwhile, Clara changed. Her smile grew more frequent, soft and distant, as if she carried a secret too vast to share. Yet beneath the warmth, her form thinned, her skin seeming stretched too tight over fragile bones. When Elias confronted her, she met his gaze with a serenity that chilled him. "I feel as though I belong to something vast," she said quietly. "You should stop resisting, Elias. It's easier to let go." Her voice held a strange resonance, like two voices woven together, a faint echo that lingered after the words had left her lips. It was as if more than one presence spoke through her, yet she remained herself, or a version of her. One night, as the chapel was filled with the dim flicker of candlelight, Elias saw an old woman collapse mid-prayer. Her hands fell from the rosary, her body crumpling to the stone floor. Two sisters appeared silently, lifting her between them, but instead of carrying her to a bed or the infirmary, they moved toward the graveyard beyond the willow trees. The woman was not dead, not yet, but her breath was faint, her eyes half closed in a trance. Elias followed at a distance, heart pounding as the sisters lowered the woman beside a freshly turned mound. The night air was cold, the willows whispering secrets he could not understand. He wanted to call out, to stop whatever was happening, but the silence of the graveyard swallowed his voice. Before it could form, the sisters spoke in hushed tones, a language foreign yet ancient, their words rising and falling like the tide. The woman's chest rose once, faint and slow, and then still, when they left. Elias knelt beside the grave, the soil soft beneath his fingers. The earth had not settled. It was fresh and waiting. He looked back at the convent, its windows glowing, faintly in the distance. Waiting for what? He wondered. The convent grew colder still in the depths of winter, the stones steeped in shadow and secrets. Elias knew he could wait no longer. Each day, the weight of what he had seen and heard pressed harder against his soul, and the whispers in his mind urged him onward, into places forbidden, into truths that could shatter the fragile peace the sisters so carefully preserved. Late one evening, when the corridors lay deserted and the candles burned low, Elias slipped from his chamber, his breath a thin mist in the cold air. He moved silently through the convent, past closed doors and shuttered windows, until he reached the abbess's quarters, a heavy oak door, carved with patterns like curling vines. The faint glow of candlelight leaked beneath its edges, heart-pounding. Elias reached for the iron handle and eased the door open. Inside, the room was modest but lined with shelves heavy with books, their spines cracked and worn with age. Against one wall stood a chest, bound in leather, secured with brass clasps tarnished by time. Elias knelt, hands trembling as he released the clasps and lifted the lid. Within lay a trove of journals, their pages yellowed and brittle. The earliest entries were penned in a delicate, flowing hand, dates reaching back to 1742, nearly a century and a half before Elias's time. He opened the first volume and began to read by the flickering candlelight. The words spoke of the breath of the hollow, an ancient spirit that dwelled in the marshlands beneath the convent. It was described not as a god or demon, but as a force, a breath, a pulse that could heal wounds and mend the broken, but at a terrible cost. To receive the breath is to surrender the light within. One entry read, "It is a trade of essence for life, a pact with the unseen that demands a steady offering to maintain its favor." The sisters were not mere healers, but keepers of the hollow's balance, guardians who ensured that the spirit's hunger was sated, in exchange for protection from plague, famine, and the ravages of time. Elias's fingers trembled as he turned the pages, each journal chronicling the decades that passed. A pattern emerged, clear and chilling. Every 10 years, a marked rise in the number of deaths occurred. The journals spoke of seasons of hunger, times when the hollow's demand intensified, and the convent's caretakers gathered their offerings with grim resolve. One entry, dated exactly 10 years before Elias's arrival, noted a spike. Of 60 souls lost that winter, the following decade saw fewer deaths, and the one before that, 70. This winter, the journal warned, was such a season. Elias's eyes skimmed to the final journal, written in a hand unmistakably Sister Miriam's, the same steady, measured script he had glimpsed on the ledger. Pages. The words at the bottom of the page struck him with cold finality. 78 must be given, that we may be spared the century's end. The number matched the ledger's tally perfectly. 78 souls buried since the last season began. Elias closed the journal with a slow, trembling breath. The convent was not a sanctuary. It was a place of bargains and blood, where life was borrowed and paid for in shadows. And this winter, the hollow's hunger was nearing its peak. He heard footsteps behind him and turned quickly. Sister Miriam stood in the doorway, her gaze steady and unreadable. "You were not meant to see this," she said softly, though her voice carried no anger. "Why?" Elias asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Why take so many lives? To survive is to give," she replied. "The hollow protects us, but it is never satisfied. Our duty is to maintain the balance, to keep the hollow at bay, or risk losing all." Elias looked past her, toward the flickering candle flames. "And Clara? The others? Are they vessels too?" Sister Miriam's eyes darkened, the faintest shadow crossing her face. "They are the chosen, the ones who have received the breath fully. They carry the hollow's light within them now. But light is a fragile thing. It must be nurtured, or it fades." Elias swallowed the growing dread. rising in his chest. The sisters were not saviors. They were prisoners of a cycle older than memory, bound to a spirit whose hunger would never be satisfied, and whose price was paid in flesh and breath. As he left the room, the echo of his footsteps felt like the ticking of a clock, counting down the days until the hollow claimed its due. The floodwaters were relentless. The marsh had claimed the convent's roads, swallowing them beneath cold, black water that churned with a quiet menace. What had once been a path home was now a twisting river of mud and ice, isolating St. Hildegard's mercy from the world beyond. Supplies grew scarce. Flourished gardens lay beneath feet of water. Firewood was rationed by the hour, and the chill seeped deeper into the bones of every soul within the stone walls. And then the deaths began again. More sudden, more frequent. Patients who had only just been declared healed grew pale and listless by morning. Their hearts slowed until they stopped altogether, leaving hollow shells where life had barely taken root. The sisters were restless now. Their chants echoed louder through the halls, faster and more urgent, as if each syllable was a plea to the darkness itself. Elias could no longer bear the silence that had settled over the convent's halls. One cold evening, with the wind rattling the windows like skeletal fingers, he sought out Sister Miriam. He found her in the chapel, standing alone, before the altar where the black water once shimmered. The flicker of candlelight caught the silver in her hair, turning it to moonlight. Her eyes met his, steady and resigned. "You know the truth," Elias said quietly. "These deaths, they're not accidents. They're the price." She nodded. "Necessary mercy." "Mercy?" Elias's voice cracked. "How can taking lives be mercy?" "The hollow hungers," she said, folding her hands. "If we do not offer it grace, it will take what it pleases, without limit, without reason." He swallowed hard, the weight of her words crushing down on him. "Clara," he began. "She's marked, the 78th, the final offering." Sister Miriam's gaze darkened, and a sadness flickered behind her storm-gray eyes. "Yes, she is." Elias staggered back, the cold biting through his cloak. "You mean to sacrifice her?" "It is not sacrifice," she said. "It is salvation, for her and for us all. Once the number is fulfilled, the hollow's hunger will recede for another decade." He looked toward the chapel door, where the willows bowed like mourners outside. "Is there no other way?" Sister Miriam shook her head. "There never was." Elias's heart broke for Clara, for the sister he had vowed to protect, now marked as the price of their survival. And yet, beneath his grief, a spark of defiance stirred. If salvation demanded this, then perhaps salvation could also be stolen back. The floodwaters had not yet receded. They lapped hungrily at the convent's walls, a cold, unyielding force that turned hope into a distant memory. Elias had done all he could. With heavy furniture and thick blankets, he barricaded the door of his chamber, creating a fragile sanctuary for Clara and himself. They huddled together in the dim light, the walls closing in like the silence before a storm. But Clara was no longer the sister Elias had known. She sat by the window, her hands folded loosely in her lap, eyes distant yet bright with something eerie and serene. "Let me go, Elias," she said one evening, her voice soft and steady like a prayer. He shook his head, heart clenched tight. "I won't lose you. The sickness we fled was meant to kill me," she whispered. "The hollow, it's only taking me gently. Its embrace is like coming home." Her words echoed in the cold room, filling the corners with a sorrow deeper than any storm outside. Elias reached for her hand, but she pulled away, a faint, knowing smile curling her lips. That night, the convent fell into a silence unlike any. Before from the chapel, a chant began, low at first, then rising, swelling into a ceaseless tide of sound. It was the final vigil, the sisters said, a continuous prayer until the 78th soul was taken, the last offering to end the hollow's hunger for another decade. The air grew thick with the weight of their voices, each syllable a thread pulling at the very breath of the world. Elias found himself breathing harder, the air seeming to thicken in his lungs. Each inhale was a labor, each exhale, a small surrender. He felt drawn toward the chapel, as if the breath of the hollow itself was calling to him, a cold hand pressing against his chest, demanding entry. Clara's face appeared in his mind, serene, pale, marked by the spiral above her heart. The room darkened. The chanting rose, Elias's breath faltered, and the world seemed to hold its breath with him. The night air was thick with a storm that had no thunder, no rain, only an unsettling stillness that pressed on the skin and sank into the bones. Elias moved with desperate purpose, his footsteps echoing through the cold stone halls of the convent. The chant from the chapel pulsed like a heartbeat in his ears, a relentless summons that sought to pull him under. The door to the chapel loomed ahead, an ancient barrier between hope and despair. Without hesitation, Elias forced it open. Inside, the sisters circled the altar, their voices rising in unholy harmony. In the center, the black water bowl shimmered with that oily light, reflecting the flickering candles like a portal to darkness itself. Clara lay there, serene and pale, her chest barely rising with breath, a fragile thread tethering her to the world. Elias's hands trembled as he reached out and overturned the bowl. The water spilled across the stone floor, seeping quickly into the cracks, disappearing as though the earth itself drank greedily. The sisters screamed, a sound both human and otherworldly, their faces twisted with rage and fear. The chapel walls shuddered, as if the very foundation protested the disruption. Outside, the willow branches thrashed violently. Though no wind stirred the frozen air, Elias gathered Clara into his arms, her body light, almost weightless, like a whisper. He fled toward the door, heart pounding with hope and terror. But the marsh was awakening. The floodwaters, once a quiet barrier, now roared with unnatural hunger, swirling at his feet. From beneath the surface, pale hands broke the glassy calm, thin fingers clawing. Upward, desperate, grasping, they reached for him, for Clara, for the breath they had lost. Elias stumbled, the cold water pulling at his legs, dragging him toward the depths. The hands multiplied, rising in a tide of pale desperation, reaching, clutching, begging for release. His own breath caught in his throat. In that moment, he understood. The hollow was not just a spirit, but a hunger born of those taken, trapped between life and death, caught in an endless exchange of breath and soul. And now, it claimed him too. The floodwaters rose like a living thing, cold, dark, and relentless. Elias did not hesitate. He plunged into the marsh, the icy water closing over his head, pulling him under with the desperate force of something ancient and hungry. Clara's frail body was cradled against his chest, her skin impossibly pale, yet warm to his touch. Around them, the hands reached, thin, pale fingers grasping for breath, for life, for escape from the shadow between worlds. Elias fought forward, driven by a desperate hope, his lungs burning for air he dared not yet take. The line of the old road appeared, faint and wavering like a memory through the flood. With one last surge, Elias pushed beyond the grasping hands, breaking free into shallow water where roots and stones gripped his feet. The hands loosened, sinking back beneath the surface as the wind died. Then silence fell over Briar Hollow. Elias collapsed onto the muddy bank, coughing, gasping, the cold air burning his lungs. But Clara was gone. No sign of her body remained. In the night, the floodwaters receded as if pulled back by unseen hands, leaving the convent stranded and empty, its stones cold and waiting. The graveyard, beyond the willow trees, bore 78 fresh markers, their stones carved and cold beneath the mourning branches. Years passed, and the story of Briar Hollow slipped into whispered legend. Travelers spoke in hushed tones of miraculous healings, of the sisters' kindness, and the peace that settled over those who came seeking salvation. But no one remembered the winter of 1809 for no one, except Elias. He wandered the earth, haunted by memories of breath stolen and given, of bodies trapped between light and shadow. And in the quiet hours before dawn, he still woke gasping, the faint sound of chanting echoing in his dreams, a reminder that some bargains are never truly broken, and some breaths are never fully returned.